When I look around the world at the moment, I sometimes wonder what's happening around us. And I consider myself to be a reasonably logical sort of person. I've got an engineering degree. I'm a manager at a government department. I'm widely read. You probably think you're a logical sort of person as well. But I really do wonder when I have a look at this world and the news that we see around us, the actions of this world, where's it all going? You know, is this a world, is this an earth that I'm happy for my children to grow up in? Is this an earth that offers a future for my grandchildren? What's happening out there? And you see this as well, and there's lots of examples around us. Here's an event that happened late last year in Papua New Guinea when the police force went on strike. And there's no law and order at all, nothing, zip. And all the locals came through and raided and looted all of the stores. No law, no order. You imagine that in your home and in our city. Here's a protest, a march that happened in October last year in Poland. And we can see increasing levels of anti-Semitism and racial rows that are happening. And the solution for these people on the screen is to clean up the world by putting the Jews in the bin. Now, can you imagine that? Clean up this world by putting people in the bin. What a terrible thing to say. That's where our world is going. And we see this over and over and over with the China Coast Guard, a little bit closer to home. And China's now claiming almost all of the sea between the Philippines and Vietnam. And you've heard, I'm sure, that they're actively wanting to take over Taiwan. And sure, there's some messy history there. It's not clear, it's not clean, but this is nothing short of international bullying. This is terrible events that are happening out there. And you might remember this one in the US, in Maine, in Lewiston, in October last year, where 19 people died at the hands of a man who was mentally unwell, and he heard voices, but he was allowed to own an automatic firearm. And he went out and shot a whole lot of people dead. I wonder if you knew that each year in the US since 2014, so that's the last 10 years, each year in the US, about 39,000 people lose their life to gun deaths every single year. And that's through mass shootings and domestic violence and suicides. 39,000 people each year over the last 10 years in the US have died from a gun. And then a little bit closer to home, very sadly, in Sydney in April this year, we had this event when again another mentally unwell man got to the point in his life, sadly, that he took a long knife and 6 people died in a busy Sydney shopping centre. Just like the shopping centre near your home and my home, just the same. That happened in April this year. And many of us might be across some of the climate woes that are in this world at the moment, and the fact that the world is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and you know, it's hard to deny that these days. 20, 30 years ago, perhaps there were lots and lots of doubters in the world. It's hard to doubt that now. And last year, 2023, has been confirmed as the hottest year on record. Perhaps what we don't know is that each of the 9 last years were the hottest years on record. And year after year after year, for 9 years in a row, we've had a new record set for the warmest, the hottest year on record. And last year, there were over 200 days out of that 1 year that set a new global record for an average temperature for that time of year. 200 out of the 365 days were new daily records. And this year, 2024, we're almost halfway through it. We're on track for a new record. And I subscribe to The Economist magazine. I love the magazine. They're witty, I think impartial. They report very well. Look at this cover here that they've put together, a report card on the Earth's global efforts towards climate change. Some progress, must try harder, they say. And there we have it. They've given us a B+ for making commitments. We're very good at that. They've given us a D- for keeping them. Not as good at keeping commitments. Climate finance, incomplete. Didn't get there. Not done. Adaptation, another D. Renewables, C+. Investment, D. Not happening. They're scathing about what the world is doing at the moment. And last December in Dubai, at the COP28 climate summit that was held, delegates from more than 110 countries got together and they made lots of pledges. In fact, they pledged to improve renewable energy capacity and efficiency by 2030. And they said lots of good things. But several big oil producers didn't sign up to the commitment. I could name them tonight, but I'm not going to. The big ones said, no, we're not on board. We're not doing enough. And that's before we start to talk about interesting things like artificial intelligence. We're entering a new era of synthetic reality. What is reality? What is truth? And these things do amazing things. They are very, very impressive. They can forecast the weather. They can diagnose diseases. And I read a really, really great article late last year in The Economist magazine of this AI machine that could predict ship-killing rogue waves. And it was so good that the scientists who programmed it and came out of it knew that it was right, but they didn't understand how it came up with the outcomes. It was just beyond them. They could not get what this thing spat out at the end of the day. And you might have heard of a company called OpenAI. They came to our news late last year when they sacked their CEO and then reappointed him in the same week. It's a not-for-profit company that was founded as a research lab aimed at safely developing AI. And their aim is to develop that AI that can equal us or surpass humans in all types of thinking. They're going to think better, further, longer than all human thought. Where's that going? What's it going to do? What can you believe? What will you believe? What's information? What's disinformation? How much of this world is going to be populated by content that's not generated by you and me, that's generated by a machine in the corner? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think most of us are saying, where's that all going to go? And then we look around the world and we look at Sudan, where literally millions of people are genuinely struggling to find food every single day when the country's at war, because two big men are fighting each other. And speaking about countries being nervous of war at the moment, Poland has just doubled their military size, their army and their budget. Finland's trying to get into NATO. Saudi Arabia's pursuing a defence treaty with the United States. Why are they doing that? Because they're scared, because they're nervous, because it's a crazy world. And I think if you're a logical person, you've seen that in the world as well. So when we come to the scriptures, perhaps it's a little bit reassuring when we read that God said, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man who walks to direct his steps. We don't do a very good job. We're not good custodians of this planet. We're not great custodians of our future, of collaboration and cooperation, working together for mutual great outcomes. It's not in man to direct our steps. We haven't got a good track record in this area. But if we want to stay in the scripture, it's therefore a great relief to me to know that God knows that, and he's got the future of this world all in his control. All of it. And I love quotes like this. They're just beautiful. God says in Isaiah chapter 46, he says, I am God, and there is none like me, declaring, look at this, the end from the beginning, and from ancient days things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. He says, I know what's going to happen. I can declare the end from way, way, way back at the beginning. And from ancient times, way, way back there, I can tell you things that are not yet done. He's got it all in hand. And that's something that none of us can do. With respect, tomorrow morning we may think we're going to get up and have our breakfast and go to work or go to uni or go to school or do whatever things we think we're going to do tomorrow. We cannot guarantee that. Isaiah 46 says, God can. He knows where it's all going. So what a wonderful thing. So let's come to the Bible then. If God's claim is that he knows everything, that this Bible tells us where this world is tracking, that this Bible foretold that there was going to be some tough things, let's have a look at the Bible and let's get some confidence and some reassurance from what it starts to tell us. What we're going to do is look at two case studies. The first case study is the current Israel-Gaza conflict that's still happening in the Middle East today. And that area rarely has genuine peace, does it? There's rarely a time of genuine absence of conflict in the Middle East. It's an area where people fight for their existence. It's an area where people fight for their homes. It's an area where people fight to kill other people in other neighbourhoods and other nations and to exterminate them. It's a tough area. And when you have a look at that, there's some principal areas involved. We have, starting from the bottom of the screen, Gaza itself, which is controlled by a group called Hamas, which have been on all of our news pages since October last year. It's one of the most densely populated areas on earth. 2.2 million people at least used to live in that little strip of land between Israel and Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea. And then moving further upwards, we have Israel, who was created as a nation back in 1948, a nuclear power, generally with the backing of Western nations. We have the West Bank, on the western side of the Jordan there, another Palestinian area. We have, right at the top of the map, Lebanon, whose political party, Hezbollah, is a military power. Not the main ruling party, but a very, very strong party in Lebanon. And they happen to have 150,000 missiles, all pointing south at Israel. There's no love lost in that area. And then in the Far East, we have Iran, verging on nuclear capability with a mandate to destroy Israel. It's a tough place to live, isn't it? You imagine living there. You know, sometimes in Adelaide, we get a bit stroppy when our bin doesn't get picked up. You think about living in this place, where up north you've got 150,000 missiles pointing south at your country. And over here you've got a people who has a constitutional arrangement that wants to exterminate your country. It's a terrible place to live. And we had a big conflict that initiated on the 7th of October last year, when a group called Hamas in Gaza attacked the neighbouring country of Israel. We have two very distinct nations in this area, two groups that claim the same area as their eternal homeland, two groups that claim the same city as their religious capital. That can never happen, can never work, can it? When you've got two very, very different groups that probably hate each other more than any hate you've seen in your life, and who both claim the same land and the same city as their eternal capital. How can that happen? And we can see that that's a recipe for conflict. And the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, didn't do himself any favours in September last year, the month before this invasion, when he showed the world this map, a map of the new Middle East, he called it, describing the work of the Abraham Accords, and either deliberately or insensitively not showing Gaza on the map at all, or the West Bank, and so mocking every associated UN resolution. Not a smart move. And so on the 7th of October, we had this surprise attack when Hamas launched 5,000 rockets at Israel in this early morning attack, breaching Israel's border in at least 5 places. And about 1,200 people were killed, mostly civilians, mostly Jews, other nations as well. And 240 people were taken hostage. And Israel has declared in response that it will destroy Hamas and remove them as a threat. And they continue to try and do that to this day. And in the process, the Hamas-run Gazan Ministry of Health states that now nearly 37,000 people in Gaza have lost their life due to that effort. What a mess. And this is how the Economist magazine show that. You know, the one on the left is the first cover after the 7th of October invasion. And it shows the anguish of these 1,200 civilians that are killed, all minding their business, all doing on Saturdays the sorts of things that you and I do on our Saturdays. And then 240 people are taken hostage by one of the world's toughest terrorist groups. And when's it going to finish for the little girl in the middle? When's she going to get her home back? When's she going to get appropriate schooling and hospital care back? When's she going to get her apartment back? What about all the tens of thousands of deaths since? And notice how the covers on the left are in black. They're in mourning. And someone's come up with the idea on the right that maybe peace is possible, but look at how they've illustrated that cover with this butterfly, a symbol of peace and happiness, and the flags of Israel and the Palestinian people on its wings. But in the background is a bullet-ridden, arid piece of sand. It's a very difficult place, isn't it? And since then, we've had some more things. We had an airstrike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus in April this year by Israel, and 16 people were killed, including 8 officers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And then the Iranians responded on the 14th of April, a couple of months ago, by launching approximately 170 drones and 30 cruise missiles and 120 ballistic missiles to Israel. And what's of interest for those who follow the Middle Eastern politics is that this is the first time that that's been launched from Iran itself. Historically, it's always been launched from its proxies in the surrounding nations. This is scary, isn't it? You know, what's going to happen? It's still happening right now. I wonder if we thought that it was a 2-week skirmish and then it'd be sorted. It's June 2024. This is still happening. Well, now we can turn to our Bible and find that God knew that this place was going to be a place of great anguish. And if we come to our reading in Zechariah chapter 12, we find that these Palestinians and these Jews, these Israelis, with their competing claims over Jerusalem and that land, are at the very, very centre of that conflict that God told us about in Zechariah chapter 12. Let's read on the screen the oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. And on that day I will make Jerusalem, a heavy stone for all of the peoples. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. On that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness. Let's pick up some key points from those verses. Firstly, we note that this message is all about Israel. Verse 1, line 1. It's a burden. It's an oracle. This is not a good news story. This is not an Enid Blyton story. This is tough. This is heavy, tough news to digest. This is a burden, Israel, that's going to come on that land. But look who it comes from. It comes from God. A God that often in the Bible describes himself as the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, or Israel. But that's not how he describes himself here. He's now describing himself as the God of the whole earth. I'm not just the God of this bit. I am the God of the planet. See that in verse 1? Thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man. I'm not a local God. I'm a universal God. And I've got a big burden about Israel. And so in verses 2 and 3, we go on to find out that a situation is described that will affect the whole earth. If you've got a little colouring pencil or a lead pencil or something, it's good to make a note of these. Look at the magnitude of this in verse 2. All the surrounding peoples. Verse 3, all the peoples, all who lift it, all the nations of the earth. Verse 4, every horse. This is massive. This is not a small thing. This prophecy has global consequences. It's huge. The scale is very, very significant. And what's going to happen? Well, in verse 2, it was about Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is going to become a cup of staggering or trembling. It means to reel, just like if you were intoxicated, if you were drunk. This city, this place, this city is going to reel. It's going to be a place of trembling. If you drink the cup of Jerusalem, you will reel like you were intoxicated. That's what this section is happening. And then in verse 3 it goes on, I'm going to make Jerusalem like a heavy stone, a stone that is heavy or burdensome. And the word hurt there in verse 3 means cut themselves. They'll cut themselves in pieces. And what it does, it employs a Hebraism whereby it repeats a word. And you would have seen this in the Old Testament. If you've read the Old Testament, you might not have noted it, but you would have seen it, for example, in the book of Exodus, where it talks about the most holy place. There's no word for most, it simply says holy, holy place. It repeats the word for the effect. The most holy place was a holy, holy place. And here it's cut themselves. Grab an e-sword when you get home tonight and have a look at that. That's the impact of this word. The word is repeated. It's a very significant time. And God is saying all nations are going to get caught up in this Jerusalem problem. If you go and drink the cup of Jerusalem, it's like you'll be intoxicated. If you try and lift this stone, you'll get completely cut in pieces. And all the nations are going to try and grapple with this, and they'll be filled with a panic. The horses, every horse will panic, every rider with madness. And the horses here would symbolize the war machines of today, the armies of the invaders. And they're all in panic, and there's chaos everywhere because it's just too big and it's too hard. And so Zechariah says, I got some heavy news about Israel. From the God of the whole earth, that's going to impact all nations. Because Jerusalem's going to be a cup of staggering and a heavy stone, and the nations will be hurt and thrown into a panic. And that's exactly what's happened. Exactly what's happened. You have a little reflection on what did happen. And the world leaders that visited Israel after the crisis. On the screen here, you can see US President Biden. You can see Anthony Blinken, America's Secretary of State. You can see Britain's PM Rishi Sunak, and France's Emmanuel Macron, and Germany's Olaf Scholz, and Italy's Giorgia Meloni. There's the EU's head, Ursula von der Leyen. Australia's ex-Prime Minister Scott Morrison was over there. The ex-UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson was over there. How did they come together? Not just come together, they visited Israel. Would they have come to Australia? I think not. Would they have come to any other place in the world? I think not. But God said in Zechariah 12, this is a place that affects all the world and all nations, and it intoxicates people when you get to drink the cup of Jerusalem. All of these leaders, world leaders, it's a who's who list, isn't it? Came to Jerusalem. And other people commented as well. They didn't come, but we had the late Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi. We had the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, the Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh. They weren't terribly complimentary, but they all spoke internationally on the situation. What brought this group together? Zechariah chapter 12. And since then, think of the international protests and what's happened. In some parts of the world, and this is number 10 Downing Street, we've had the flag illuminated, the Jewish flag illuminated many parts of the world in sympathy for what happened. In other parts, we've seen significant pro-Palestinian protests right around the world, including here in Adelaide. And you can see the slogan there on the banners, from the river to the sea, runs the slogan, Palestine will be free. It's a tough observation. But if you take that literally, there's no room for Jews in the land. From the River Jordan to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, if Palestine is free in that, then there is no Israel. That's the truth, the tough truth that these slogans are putting up. And since then, in the months we've had all of these college tent cities jump up. This is the one in the Columbia College lawn, where they pitched their tents and declared it the Gaza Solidarity Encampment. And that's gone on right through this world, including here in Australia. And it's had other effects in the world. You know, isn't this amazing? Shipping impacts. Because Yemen and the Houthis have got on board, and when boats that are supposedly aligned with the West or Israel come past, then they'll shoot missiles at them. So you can see in the top picture on the right-hand side what used to happen with all of those boats that used to all go through the Suez Canal, and look where they're all going now, round the Cape of Good Hope. Huge impact, a global impact, just because of Zechariah 12. It's so big and it's so hard. And sadly, it's going to happen again. This is a Hamas official in October the 24th, 2023. Just a matter of weeks after the 7th of October. And this official said Israel is a country that has no place on our land. We must remove that country. The Al-Aqsa flood is just the first time, and there will be a second and a third and a fourth. Will we have to pay a price? Yes, and we're ready to pay it. We are proud to sacrifice martyrs. So the 7th of October wasn't a defining moment. It was one of many moments. It'll happen again. And that's what God said in Zechariah 12. This is just too hard. It's too tough. It's too difficult. And so again, we just reflect on the Economist magazine covers. How is peace possible? You know, Israel is all alone there, blown around in this crazy desert storm. How do we end the Middle East agony? What's going to happen? I don't have the answer. And no man, woman, or nation on earth has the answer, because it is too hard, says God in Zechariah chapter 12. And a two-state solution is not going to happen. and it cannot be the answer. So we wait for the scriptures to outwork themselves as we look at that case study. This is a case study of the events of this world that are just terrible and dramatic and happening right now. And it's comforting to know that God saw thousands of years ago that this was going to take place. Let's have a look at a second case study. This is the war that's happening again right now between Russia and Ukraine. That's been happening since February 2022, when on the 24th of February, the Russian President Putin announced that Russia was moving ahead with what he called a special military operation in Ukraine, and he launched the biggest attack by one state against another in Europe since World War II. This has resulted in 10 million refugees fleeing Ukraine and civilian fatalities in the tens of thousands due to massacres and indiscriminate shelling. And what Mr. Putin tried to do in Ukraine, and that is to seize the territory of an entire country, was last attempted when Mr. Saddam Hussein tried to take Kuwait way back in 1990. Now, if we have a look at the maps of the area, we can see the before and the after there. The before on the left, which has got some salmon pink areas of some areas that Russia had previously annexed. And when we say annexed, we mean came in and just taken. They came in and they said, thank you very much, I'm going to take that land. And now they call that Russia. And that is the area, the peninsula of Crimea. So that's on the left, and that was annexed or taken by force by Russia in 2014. On the right, you see the events in the weeks, the month after February 2022, when Russia came in and has had control of approximately, plus or minus a few percent, about 19-20% of Ukraine at any one time. Millions of people have been displaced. Mr. Putin really wants Ukraine, doesn't he? This is the biggest thing since World War II. He's gone in and annexed Crimea. He's then gone in and annexed other provinces within Ukraine. And The Economist magazine comments on it, and they said, look at the date, 29th of January 22, the few weeks before the invasion. They said it would be terribly risky and costly, tough thing to do, but it would make Putin the Russian leader who restored much of historical Russia and established a new buffer against NATO. It would make him a hero in his own country. It would achieve a lot of his goals as a leader to buffer against the West and NATO in Western Europe. It would be a very, very risky thing, but wow, it would make him a hero. And so this has been a constant, again, in the world's magazines and news for the last 2.5 years. Look at all of the, again, Economist magazine covers there. And in case you didn't know, the Ukrainian flag is blue and yellow. Look at the one on the top left, as the flag bleeds. And all of those things that are happening, and on the right, we've got this big, big Russian bear that's sitting there, and all of the West is wheeling across all these smart people and dignitaries, and they're feeding in some cash and feeding in some equipment, and the bear's just waiting there to lap it up. 2 days ago, on the 14th of June 2024, Mr. Putin, the president, re-outlined his demands of Ukraine for what he would require for a ceasefire and peace. He was the offender. He came in and he invaded Ukraine, and now he re-outlined his demands 2 days ago, last Friday, the 14th of June. And he said, as soon as you do these two things, you accept that Russia owns all of those salmon pink areas, Crimea, and all of those provinces on the east, my apologies. And secondly, as soon as you stop looking for membership of NATO, we'll agree a peace treaty straight away. That was his terms. And Ukraine says, no way, We're only going to start talking peace when you withdraw from all of those areas. Russia's saying, this is the new reality. Get used to it. Move on. Now again, what's so exciting for Bible readers is that the Bible talks about this as well. Now I've got this on some screens here. Sorry, that's the image of Mr. Putin making this big statement on Friday. I've got this on the screen. You can look this up if you would like, in Ezekiel in chapter 38, where we have a magnificent prophecy that details things that's going to happen to a latter-day Russia. And I'll read the screen. Son of man, set your face towards Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, as it should be, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him and say, thus says the Lord God, behold, I'm against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and I'm going to bring you out and all your army and your horses and horsemen, and they're going to be clothed with armour, a huge host, all of them with buckler and shield wielding swords, Persia, Cush and Put are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. It sounds like a big war, doesn't it? I need you just to note a couple of things on this slide. First of all, this entity Gog, who is of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, and down the bottom of the slide, this group called Persia. So if we try to understand what these few verses in Ezekiel in chapter 38 are about, we can work out that this Gog, the word means the one at the top. This is the leader. This is the boss, the ones who's in charge of this big group that's going to come down and do some invading. We can look at this land of Magog, and we can track down that this is the modern day area of Ukraine and Central Europe. Incredible, isn't it? That Ukraine was spoken about in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 2, 2,500 years ago. And we can identify that this prince of Rosh, that Rosh means Russia. And you don't need to take my word from that, because we can consult some of the best authorities on words in the world. Here's Edward Gibbon, who wrote a book called Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. There has been no greater book ever written on the history, the decline and the fall of this Roman period. And Gibbon wrote, among the Greeks, this national appellation or name for the Russians has a singular form of Rus. There it is, Edward Gibbon. But we could go on, and we could go to a gentleman called Gesenius, who wrote a lexicon, a word dictionary of the Hebrew and Chaldee Old Testament. And he said that this word, Rus, is a proper noun of the northern nation, undoubtedly the Russians. And we could go on, and we could look at a gentleman called Bocard, who wrote a book back in the 1600s called The Sacred Geography. And he said that Rus is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of Russia. We don't have to accept our names. We can go back to the historians in the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s, and they're all saying that Ezekiel 38 verse 2, the Rus there is Russia. Wow. So not only do we have Magog being spoken about 2,500 years ago, we also have Russia being spoken about. And we can map them, and there they are. So Magog is modern Ukraine and Belarus and Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania and maybe the areas to the west of that. And then we have Russia is this Rosh, this Rus, as the historic commentators and writers have said. Mr. Putin wrote in 2021 in his famous or infamous 5,000-word essay, he said, Russia was robbed when it lost Ukraine, and I'm confident that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. He says, I want it back. And that's what he's done since February 2022. It's something that good Bible students have always expected, because that's what Ezekiel 38 said. And then we go to further understand Ezekiel, we find that there's a list of nations that are accompanying Gog, And the very, very first one on that list is Persia, which today is Iran. I find this absolutely breathtaking. There's this group called Gog, this leader called Gog of Russia, from the land of Magog, and he's got a whole lot of people behind him, and the very, very first one is Iran. And you look at your news again, we don't like this world. Well, look what's happening in this world. This is a news extract in the BBC from December 2022 that said at that stage that Iran, or Persia in Ezekiel 38, was now Russia's top military backer. And they're helping out with fully fledged defence partnerships and drones and weapon development and training. Iran, said the BBC in December 2022, is Gog's number one backer. Absolutely incredible. You know what happened last Friday as well? 2 days ago, there's a G7 summit in Italy, as I'm sure you've seen on your news. And this is one of the statements that they made that's reported by Reuters there. We call on Iran to stop assisting Russia's war. Wow. In Ukraine, and not to transfer ballistic missiles and related technology, as this would represent a substantive material escalation and a direct threat to European security. Look at that list of leaders. The G7, the world G7, and they met 2 days ago in Italy on the 14th of June, and they said, we are asking Iran to stop supporting Russia. I'm absolutely sure none of them had read Ezekiel 38, verse 5. But there it is. First on the list is Persia. Unbelievable. And so when we keep on to understand this, we then find in the rest of this little section, which we won't read now, but there's this huge confederacy. It's a massive confederacy. In fact, it goes on and on and on. I've just got a couple of verses there. There's many people in verse 6. There's lots of military equipment in verses 4, 5, and 15. They come down like a storm. It's going to be massive, says the Bible. And this Gogian host is going to come down and sweep through with this big conglomerate of nations with Iran as their number one backer. And right now we're seeing that prophecy in action because Mr. Putin has done all he could to take Magog, Ukraine, because Gog has to be of the land of Magog. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Mr. Putin is necessarily Gog. He's doing everything that Ezekiel 38 suggests Gog will do. And Gog is setting themselves up to come down exactly as Ezekiel said. And so when we come back to Isaiah 46, God says, there's none like me. I declare the end from the beginning. And way back there, the ancient times, I declared the things that are not yet done. And he says, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose. And everything in the scriptures that God has said will happen. And we're living in days like few have lived in. And we can see those events in Zechariah 12 and Ezekiel 38 in the chaos of this world being explained. And in terms of Bible language, we see prophecy being fulfilled, prophecy being the mould into which history is poured, prophecy being a mould that history is poured into, and history has no alternative but to fill that mould perfectly. It cannot do anything else because God said, I make the rules and I declare the end way back in the beginning. And so as a Bible student, this gives me a lot of hope. This is my logic, and I think this might be your logic too. Bible prophecies have already been fulfilled, lots of them. And one of the greatest is the re-establishment of the nation of Israel. Absolutely incredible. But then we can see Bible prophecies currently being fulfilled. And we've had a look at the Middle East conflict and the expansion of Russia into Ukraine and this crazy whole world in turmoil, says Luke 21. And that gives me absolute confidence that the Bible prophecies about the future will also come to pass as well. I want to tell you, before we close, about another prophecy. The last prophecy for tonight. It involved a man called Abraham. Abraham lived in a place called Ur in ancient Mesopotamia about 2,000 years before Christ, or roughly 4,000 years ago. He was an idolater. He worshipped all the things in the heaven. He had many, many gods, different gods. And the God, the creator of heaven and of earth, the God of Zechariah 12 verse 1, appeared to Abraham with a promise and made a series of promises, perhaps 12 promises between the book of Genesis chapter 12, 7 promises between chapter 12 and chapter 22. And they involved Abraham, and they involved the land that Abraham would be taken to and that he would possess, and they involved a seed, an offspring, a descendant who would also inherit that land. And 2,000 years later, that seed was born. He lived on this earth. His name was Jesus. He was born as prophesied. And he taught and made his own prophecies. He was a prophet as well. And then he died. He died on the cross and he was resurrected. Resurrected means he rose again from the dead. He lives again. He died, but he was made alive again by God. So Jesus Christ also made prophecies, and this is one of his most famous. In Luke in chapter 21. And again, I'm putting this all on the screen for you. Look at these words. This is Jesus speaking. Jesus' prophecy. He made his own prophecies. Verse 20 of Luke 21, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart. These days are days of vengeance to fulfill all that's written. And alas, for the women who are pregnant, there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until that time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. What's he talking about? Well, let's take some key words in that little prophecy there. Notice the first line, Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by armies. They're going to get taken. When did Christ say this? Roughly AD 30. And he says at some point in the future, Jerusalem is going to get taken, this big city with its massive walls. And what's going to happen to them in verse 24? They're going to fall by the edge of the sword. And all the people are going to be led away captive among all nations. The Jews are going to go right through this earth. And Jerusalem, our minds go back to Zechariah 12. Jerusalem will be trampled and stood on by the Gentiles. Who's the Gentiles? The non-Jews. Wow. What a prophecy. This city, says Jesus, that I'm living in and I'm speaking in is going to get defeated and trampled. And that happened. When did it happen? In AD 70. Because that's the mold. That's prophecy. The mold said this is what's going to happen, and history had no choice but to be poured into that mold exactly as Jesus said. And we see that. We know from our history books, and you can Google this tonight. It makes really interesting reading of the terrible experiences of the Jews and the Roman governors and the captains of the time, how they came down and swept through that city and ended up, it was burnt, and all of the gold ran through the temple and the stones were ripped apart to get that gold, and the Jews were scattered through this world, exactly as Jesus said. But then Jesus went on. What about the last line on the slide? Until. It's a wonderful word, isn't it? Just a little word. All that's going to happen until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So Jesus put another parameter on his prophecy, and that's happened as well. And when did that happen? That happened in 1967. Some people in this hall can remember that. This is not old stuff. This is modern day fulfillments to old prophecies. Wow, that's meaningful. And so there's photographic evidence of these soldiers coming in and liberating Jerusalem and taking it back into the hands of the Jews. So Jesus' prophecy is right on track. But then he goes on and he says in verse 25, the next verse, there's going to be signs in the sun and moon and stars and the earth and distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves. It's going to be tough. The sea and the waves are an illustration of peoples and the turmoil. You know, people at rest is a flat sea, and waves and roaring is a unstable and unhappy sea. And all of these, figuratively, these big political symbols of the sun and moon and stars, and there's signs right through them. There's crazinesses there. Verse 26, and people are fainting with fear and with foreboding what's happening on the world. Well, I reckon that's happening now. Because when I look around, it is a crazy world. And we are very insulated from that, friends. You pick up your newspaper, you pick up the Advertiser tomorrow morning. Sadly, the best you're probably going to see on the cover is something about football. It's not reality. This world is crazy. We don't see enough of it here. And Jesus says people are going to faint with fear. You go to Sudan right now, there's millions of people that can't put food on a plate. You go to Poland, they've just doubled their army. You go to Finland, they're busting to get into NATO. They're fainting for fear. And then, says Jesus, then, only then, are they going to see the Son of Man, Jesus Christ himself, coming back to earth in a cloud with power and great glory. And that's going to happen soon. But then he adds one more thing. So when these things begin to take place, straighten up, raise up your heads, lift up your heads, your redemption is drawing near. So he gives us a little warning to get ready. We've seen all the events of Jerusalem being trampled down. We've seen 1967 and the city taken again. We see all of the crazinesses in this world. And so Christ says, get ready because I'm coming back. And there's perhaps a little summary, isn't it, from verses 20 to 24. And then verse 24, the retaking of Jerusalem. 5 and 6, this world is just crazy in its turmoil, and the sea and the waves, and men's hearts just fainting because it's so crazy. Verse 27, Christ is then going to come back, and he urges us to get ready. So this world is crazy. It is in turmoil. But I am comforted, incredibly comforted, that it offers a future for me and for you, for my children, your children, my grandchildren and your grandchildren. Because Christ is going to come back and set up his kingdom as also prophesied in this Bible, as prophesied by our God who declared the end from the beginning. And this is what he says about that time. In the latter days, right at the end, the house of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains, and all nations are going to flow to it and say, come, let us go up to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths. It's going to be a different time. It's going to be a better time. Instead of picking up the stone of Jerusalem and being hurt, all nations are now going to Jerusalem to be taught. The house of God, of Jacob, and we're learning and being educated. Instead of having a fearful, terrified heart, we have confidence in the way of the future. And we'll finish on the words of Jesus Christ in, again, one of his prophecies in the book of Revelation, how God will wipe away every tear. Have you shed a tear in the last year? I reckon you have sometime. God's going to wipe away all of those tears from their eyes. Death's going to be no more. Have you been hurt by death in the last year or 2 or 3 or 4? I suspect we have. Neither shall there be any more mourning or crying or pain anymore. All of those things are going to pass away. And it's going to be a new time, says the Bible. And I am comforted. Because yes, this world is in turmoil. Bible prophecies can be trusted. We've seen the past ones. We've seen the present ones. We've seen the future ones. We've ticked off Ezekiel 38. We've ticked off Zechariah 12. We've ticked off Luke 21. It's all going according to plan. And we noted that God wants us to be a part in his kingdom. And we noted that Jesus said, right now is the time to get ready.